All right, we're on Unit 5, Lesson 10, our last unit. And so this unit is just kind of a review of things that we've already done. So these two examples here are two different proportions that we talked about. The first one has an altitude in it. So if I'm looking at number 1, I see that where the x is right now is an altitude of that segment. So since that's an altitude, I know I'm going to use the altitude rule. And the altitude rule says part of the hypotenuse over the altitude equals the altitude over the other part of hip. Okay, so when I identify the hypotenuse of my right triangle, here's my right angle. My hypotenuse is the long side that is currently marked 100. And so when I do this proportion, we talked about in class a couple times that you can just trace it. So when I say trace it, I'm going to trace part of the hypotenuse over the altitude equals the altitude over the other part of the hypotenuse. So when I write my proportion, I need to know this segment here. And so to get the segment, it's 100 minus 36, or 64. And so now I'm ready to write my proportion. Part of the hypotenuse 64 over the altitude x equals the altitude x over the other part of the hypotenuse 36. And when I cross multiply, I get x squared equals 64 times 36. I happen to know that's 2,304. And now I'm going to take my square root. To get x by itself, you take the square root. And so I take the square root of that. I also happen to know that 2,304 is a perfect square, and the square root of that is 48. And so x equals 48 in this case. So when I go to number 2, I have a different proportion here because I know that where this x is, that's a leg of my right triangle, where 25 is the hypotenuse of the right triangle. This is a hip, and this is a leg. Okay, so that's an E there, just so you know. So I'm going to use the hip-leg rule. The hip-leg rule says hip over leg equals leg over projection. Oops, E-C-T-I-O-N. Sorry, over projection. That's a C. Okay. Hip over leg equals leg over projection. Again, you can trace it. So the hypotenuse over the leg equals the leg over the projection. It's just that little part, 9. And so when I do this one, I'm going to say the whole hypotenuse, which is 25, over the leg, which is x, equals the leg x over its projection 9. And I cross multiply. X squared equals 25 times 9. 25 times 8 is 200, so 25 times 9 is 225. And I'm going to take the square root and the square root. I also happen to know that that's a perfect square. 225 is a perfect square, and it is 15.